Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast, episode 67. Going to be covering a few topics today, but first of all I'm going to start with the Covid-19 restrictions in Victoria, and then I'm going to talk about the continuing SAS scandal and how it has escalated with China. So let's start with the Covid-19 restrictions. I'm recording this on the 1st of December 2020. So in November, the state of Victoria recorded no cases of Covid-19. And so we're supposed to be out of all restrictions. That's what we were promised by Dictator Dan. But surprise, surprise, Dictator Dan has not done that. We're now free to leave our houses. We're now free to walk upon our own streets without having to wear a mask like we're a bandit. But when you go into a building, you're supposed to put a mask on. How bizarre is that? So apparently, if you're in the same room as somebody for more than 15 minutes, you're supposed to put a mask. Both of you are supposed to put a mask on. So obviously, that's just absurd, and I have not worn a mask all year, and I'm not now. But I went to visit someone yesterday, and I reckon about 50% of people were still wearing their masks outside. So a lot of people weren't, but still a lot of people were. And someone said to me, you're passing through a lot of multicultural areas, to use a euphemism. And, so in those areas, people don't really trust each other. So, you're going to see a lot more mask use. And then you were close to the city, so there's a lot more hipsters there. So you're going to see a lot more mask use. Maybe, but I must say it's very pessimistic to see so many people still wearing masks. And every store that I went into, the people were wearing masks. I went to Woolies or Woolworths and the supermarket, and I picked up some things, only $7, $8 worth, not very much. And I went to the checkout, and there's all these cash points, where you can use your credit card. And I don't like to do that. I like to be served by a person. So I waited in line, and I did have to wait. And then I got to the line, and I took out my money, and the woman behind the counter said, "Oh, no, we're cashless. We don't accept cash." And so I just left what I was going to buy on the counter, and I walked off. And I'm like, how can this even be legal? How can it be legal that a company in Australia is not required to take Australian tender? And to be honest, I don't think it is legal. I think it is completely illegal. And the reason I left is because I was with somebody, and so I didn't want to waste the time. If I'd been there by myself, I might have made a big scene. But of course, it's not her fault. She didn't make this multi-million-dollar company, adopt this policy. She's just the person who has to cop it. But so it wasn't. I didn't want to make it a scene about her. But at the same time, how ridiculous! And these things are just being accepted by people. Just it gets me so bloody angry. So yesterday there was a big blow up in Australia's relationship with China. It's been a very bad relationship this year. It's gotten worse, and it seems to get worse every month. And what's interesting is that in 1972, Australia entered into relations with the People's Republic of China. Before that time, we recognised the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. And then after that, we dropped Taiwan, although we still kept relations with them. Our official relationship is with the People's Republic of China, what everyone calls China. And in the 1980s, the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, there's been this massive effort to make Australia and China's relationship, economic relationship, very interdependent. So beginning in the 1980s, and it was a big push in the 1980s, Australia basically deindustrialized and our factories went to China. And then that process has increased over time. And so most of the things that we buy come from China, or a good portion of them. And to such an extent that I guess we now sort of feel that whenever we buy something, we don't know where it's from. We just assume that it's from China. But this year, starting with the Covid-19, where we saw those really horrific images at the start of the year, of people just dropping dead in the street and people being forced into their house and the police boarding them up, and it looked like the zombie apocalypse. And then when it became clear that, hey, that wasn't what COVID-19 was like at all, it became, well, why were those images released and why did the Chinese government endorse them? And so the Australian government was very critical of China, and China was not very happy with that criticism. So what's happened is over that time, the relationship has just gone down and down and down. And throughout the year, China has been putting on more restrictions on Australian goods going to China. And the government has for 40 years been trying to make our relationship a free trade agreement, and now it seems like that's not happening. That's over. I have noticed an intense amount of criticism of China and anti-China feeling within Australia. People are very much, why are we buying goods from China? We shouldn't buy anything. If you buy things from China, then you're not patriotic. And it's not, don't buy things from South Korea or don't buy things from Japan. It's China. It's all about China. And our relationship, Australia and China's, has also taken a dive over recent years, but this year it seems to have really come to the fore over the South China Sea. Now, Australia's also become aware of a lot of Chinese espionage within Australia. And our government has been pathetically naive. We used to control the South Pacific. It was our ocean. And all the countries in the South Pacific looked to Australia for leadership. And then in the 1990s, starting with Keating and then John Howard, and the subsequent governments have continued this, we basically began to say, hey, listen, stop being children, be big boys, look after yourself. Stop looking for us to solve your problems. And so they did. And they went looking for another big brother, and they found it in China, right? And China's much richer than us, and so it has been pumping money into into the South Pacific. And now the Australian government is like, oh, what? But we thought this was our part of the world. We thought that nobody else was interested. Yeah, when you stop paying attention, other people become interested. And so now we're trying to make up all this lost ground that we should never have lost, because we should never have taken our eye off the ball. All of these things have continued to make the relationship bad. And then yesterday, the Chinese, and a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, released a tweet. And the tweet had a picture, a Photoshop picture, of an Australian soldier slitting the throat of an Afghan child. And the comment that goes with it is pretty much similar to what the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, the head of the Australian Army have said. They've all said, oh, this is disgraceful, this is outrageous, blah, blah, blah. And the only thing that's really outrageous about it is the picture. And I'm not sure where the picture comes from, whether it's from a newspaper or so forth. But now the Australian government has condemned China over this picture, which I must say will not increase our friendship with China in any way, and maybe that's a good thing. I think that we have been way too dependent upon China. We've put all our eggs into one basket, and it would be good if we actually started to wind back that dependence, maybe even started manufacturing things in our own country. How amazing would that be? Currently, 18% of Australia's imports come from China, about $70 billion worth. So there has been a call for a boycott of Chinese goods in Australia. But experts are saying that that's very hard to do because, cutting off 1/5 of the items that we import into the country is obviously something that's very hard to do. And secondly, that a lot of things that are built in other countries have components that are built in China. So there's some issues there. But I talked before about the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is regarded in international law as international waters. But what happened is in 1993, there was a new treaty that was signed called the Law of the Sea. And it basically said that countries could extend their maritime borders beyond the traditional 3 miles, and they could extend it out to 200 miles. And if they had a continental shelf, then they could extend that to the edge of the continental shelf. So Australia has signed that, most countries have signed that, and that means that a lot of what was once regarded as international waters are now territorial waters. But the treaty also says that except in extreme cases like war or some type of disaster, that you have to allow free passage through those waters. So that's where the South China Sea is. Now, when a country is closer together than 200 miles, then it's basically the middle, exactly the middle, and that becomes the maritime border. So the South China Sea is actually cut up between Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei. But China says, no, this sea is Chinese waters. So what the United States and a lot of other countries, including Australia, have been doing is they have been purposely going into the South China Sea to say, no, this is not China's exclusive territorial waters. Anyone can sail here, and we are. Now, China has taken a dim view of this, and what they've tried to do, and other countries have done it as well, but not as successfully as China, is they've actually created artificial islands within the South China Sea, and then they say, oh, from this island, which is part of China, we can extend our borders 200 miles. Well, other countries are not so enamored with that idea, and so the ships are a way of basically trying to say, no, we don't accept that, without actually coming out and saying we don't accept that. But China has also been warning countries, and one country that it has warned repeatedly is Australia, directly, is that we should not send our ships into the South China Sea. So there's our warships. Now, in China, there's a newspaper called the Global Times, and that's basically regarded as the mouthpiece of the Chinese government. And this is a quote from one of their editorials. As a warhound of the US, Australia should restrain its arrogance, particularly its warships must not come to China's coastal areas to flex muscles, or else it will swallow the bitter pills. So that's the kind of rhetoric that they've been spreading. And in line with that, the tweet that I talked about earlier was tweeted by a guy called Zhao Lijian, and he's China's foreign ministry spokesman. But he's also a bit of a nutter, and he's renowned for sending out these tweets. Now, in China, Twitter is banned, so these tweets are being sent out to the rest of the world. That's who they want to see these tweets, not the Chinese people. So Chinese people are getting a completely different idea of what's happening in the world. But so he's even been rebuked by Susan Rice, who was President Obama's former national security advisor, and because he was, this is what he tweeted: "If you're in Washington D.C., you know the white never go to the southwest area because it's an area for the black and Latin. There's a saying, black in and white out." So Susan Rice replied, "You're a racist disgrace and shockingly ignorant too." So he's got this reputation. So he's the guy who's tweeted out this Australian, this photoshopped photo of an Australian soldier slitting the throat of an Afghan child. And I didn't notice it first, but there's I saw there's an Australian flag and an Afghan flag, and they're on them. But underneath the Australian flag, there are all these bodies. So obviously, this is not the first person that this photoshopped Australian has murdered, and then he hides them. But also referred to as a wolf warrior. Now, the term wolf warrior comes from a Chinese action movie called Wolf Warrior 2. And the slogan of the movie is taken from the Han Dynasty. And it says, "Whoever offends China will be punished, no matter how far they are." Now, this is a big departure from normal Chinese diplomacy, which is keep everything low, everything under wraps, and talk very softly. And if you want to do things, you do things in the background, but you don't do things in the open. And now these wolf warriors, as they've been dubbed, who are supposed to be diplomats, but are quite aggressive in what they say to the West, have been pushing this new idea that China's a world power and China should act like a world power. And if that means it has to walk all over other people's sensibilities, well, yeah, fine, not a problem, do that. Well, you know, things are going to become more and more serious, aren't they? It's going to be hard to hold these things back once they get rolling. And I think that is the future. I think things are, on the international stage, they're going to heat up quite a lot. Now, I mentioned, was it last week or the week before? I think it was last week, where I said that I was a bit concerned about President Trump, and you know, there's been a lot of allegations about corruption and vote rigging within the US election, and quite frankly, I think that's true. But of course, it's one thing to believe it, and it's another thing to prove it. And I said that I hoped that President Trump's team had real, credible proof, and to date, I haven't seen any real evidence of that, which I must say is very disappointing. Once again, the Democrats will get away with their lies, and we all have to pay for it. But one interesting thing that's happened in the last week or so is Barack Obama, the former president, has released a book. And it sold hundreds of thousands of copies, as these things do. But one of the interesting things is that this isn't in the book, but it's come out from other people talking about the book. Speaking to Politico, which is a website, about Mr. Obama's concerns, one aide recalled him saying, quote, "Don't underestimate Joe's ability to F things up," unquote. And that seems to be the real attitude that Obama has towards Joe Biden. That's quite remarkable. And you will have noticed that he didn't really campaign very much for Biden. He didn't support him being a candidate in 2016 or 2016. And he hasn't been that supportive this time. He did do some public appearances to support him, but he didn't go out of his way. So it's very interesting that he has that attitude. But of course, if he becomes president, then we're all left with that attitude. And it makes me wonder. I saw on the Z-Man, he did an article where he was talking about how many people had actually voted in this election. And he said 11 million people voted for President Trump who had not voted for him in 2016. He got 11 million more votes this time than last time. But Biden got 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton got. So that's 26 million people who did not vote last election who did vote this election. Wow. If that's true, then it shows that American society is, as I think we're all observing, becoming more and more polarized. And I think it's actually a bad sign. I think it means that internal war, civil war, is closer and closer. And then, of course, we have the international situation with China. It doesn't look like we're in for happy times. It's really quite depressing in a way. Now, I'm going to finish off by talking about the Covid-19. I heard that Ice-T, the rapper, there's an article that I found here. Ice-T slammed for savagely calling out sick father-in-law. So his father-in-law was basically saying COVID-19. I don't know whether he was saying it's not real or it's not serious. And then he has now got sick and he's actually spent 40 days in ICU, which is obviously a pretty serious condition to be in. And so Ice-T has put out a message saying, oh, he's a believer now. And people have, had to go back at Ice-T saying, hey, it's your father-in-law. Maybe you shouldn't be a prick. But the interesting thing is, Ice-T is, of course, black. And his wife is not. And neither is his father-in-law. And this is something that I've noticed over and over again. Black men become successful and they marry white women. But it doesn't stop their anti-white rhetoric. My very last point is that we've actually got a heat wave in Australia. Today it's overcast. It's 27 degrees, so it's warm, but it's overcast and outside it's quite windy and it's been raining. But it's not a winter's day. It is a spring day where we get a bit of everything. But in the northern parts of Australia, and particularly New South Wales and Queensland, it's been a totally different story. Up there, we're getting already in late November, early December, degrees of nearly 50 degrees. So we've got a town, I think it's Burke, 48 degrees today. The hottest I've ever been in is 46 degrees, and it was hellish. And that was the day of Black Saturday, when the massive bushfires were here in Victoria in 2009. 48 is it's really, really hot. And there's a lot of places that are around there that are all in the 40s. That's 40s hot. And to have that this early is amazing. And one of the things that I was reading is that it's actually, most of these are about 20 degrees higher than they should be at this time of year. Now, I'm not going to say this is global warming. You get hot days, you get cold days, and sometimes they're extreme. Actually, that's normal, but it is something to comment on. Well, I think I don't have that much to say. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I'll be back next week. Bye-bye, everyone.